Hello, I'm Elizabeth Conley, a Director and Senior Interview Coach from Interview Skills Clinic. In this video, I want to share with you how to answer situational-based questions, which can often be the most difficult interview questions to answer. This video is in 3 parts. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, try and share it with a colleague or friend who's struggling at the moment to get a job, and add your questions below and I will answer them. In this video, part 1, I'm going to be demonstrating what a situational question sounds like and why I don't recommend that you take a competency star approach to these questions. Now, this is despite the fact that most of the advice you see online suggests that you should treat these questions just like a normal competency or behaviour interview. I'm going to share with you from my experience of coaching thousands of clients what is the best way to answer these questions and get a high assessment. In part 2, I'm going to be sharing a problem a client had with situational questions and demonstrate how to answer using my recommended approach, which I think can apply to both situation and also hypothetical questions. Now, if you're applying for jobs at the moment, you need to know how to handle situational and hypothetical questions, as most interviews take a blended interview style, and you're likely to get some of these questions. Whatever role you're applying for and whatever level, you can still be asked situational questions. Now, they can be assessing you on your specific technical skills to do the job, or if you're at an entry-level role, they can be a hypothetical question to see if you have the potential to do the job. So, what does a situational hypothetical question sound like? Well, it certainly doesn't begin with give me an example or tell me about a time, because that's very similar to a competency or behaviour-based question. It's going to be asking you how you will do something, normally in the role. So let's imagine for now that you're a clinical psychologist, you're going for a clinical psychologist interview. A typical question might be something like, you are providing supervision in this role, it's a very important part of this role, and you've had a disagreement with your supervisee. How do you approach this? Okay, so another example of a situational question, there's thousands and thousands of them because they're all based upon the role that you're going for. But let's imagine you're a lawyer instead. You're going for a role at the government legal department, and you could be asked, so how do you remain approachable and visible to others when you're busy? Now, the reality is that this last question could be asked to many candidates across different sectors, levels and roles. And even though we often see the civil service interviews as being very behaviour or competency based with strengths because they have this success profile, under behaviours and strengths, they can still ask these situational questions. And the question I asked is actually a question that was asked at an interview at government legal department for a lawyer role. So these are real questions. Now, the difficulty with them is that they often throw candidates. And I think the reason for this is because the question can seem both specific and actually vague at the same time. With the first question, we don't know what disagreement was had with the supervisee. And the reality is that you're going to handle that situation differently depending on what the disagreement is about. And your relationship with the supervisee, how long they've been in the role. There's so many different areas that would make a difference depending on how you would answer that question. With the second question, how do you remain approachable and visible to others when you're busy? Well, that's a very difficult and vague question. It's probably something you do all the time, but probably do it without even thinking about it. And it can be very difficult under the stress of an interview to even know what you would do, never mind articulate what you would do. And the temptation then really is that we're going to ignore the question directly and we're going to jump straight into a star example. And that's assuming that we can think of a good one in that moment in time. The star example could be about a disagreement with a supervisor, or if we had a second question, you might not jump into a star example because you may not be able to think of one, but what you might do instead is list a number of sort of actions that you engage with your team with when you are really busy, whether that's making sure that you attend the weekly meeting, having coffee with people in the morning, making sure that you email people about what you're busy on and what impact that might have on the rest of the team, whatever it might be. But, people tend to jump in directly to those actions. So those are the two main approaches that I see. Either ignore the question, and I'm just going to share an example with you that I've normally prepared earlier, or I'm going to just try and think on my feet and come up with the actions that I would do to satisfy the answer. Now, unfortunately, neither of those techniques are really the best. And you're not likely to get the highest mark. So I suppose the next question is, well, what is the best approach? Well, I think that the approach that I recommend to my clients is, first of all, always engage directly with the question. Reframe the question so that it fits with your experience more, and so that you have clearly defined the question. So if that was about the disagreement with the supervisee, actually frame it. So, what sort of disagreement could it be? If it was just a minor disagreement, what might that look like? If it was a more severe disagreement, what might that look like? And how would you answer depending on the disagreement? So first of all, engage directly with the question. Really, really important. I've listened to the question, I understand, and I'm really trying to answer it for you. Secondly, jump straight to your actions, but don't just talk about the actions. We really need, for these kind of questions, for you to talk about your thinking based on your understanding of the question. So talk through the thinking and some of the challenges you think this situation faces and the different approaches you might use. All right. And then thirdly, and this is where I think the confusion comes, it is best to say, well, I know I would do this because this is something that I've had in a very similar way, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to be sharing an example. But the difference is between sharing a star example and sharing an example that I want to talk about here is we're not going to share a star example. So you're not going to run through again the situation, the task, the actions, result. You're going to tell them the context, the situation, obviously your role, but you're going to jump straight through and say, well, the actions, because obviously this is why I mentioned the actions earlier. But let me tell you, not all of that worked. There were some challenges. I faced some resistance or whatever it might be, and dive down into one particular action to really try and demonstrate the value that you were able to bring. So we need a little bit more depth. Now that depends on the level. It's not true of every role. It's not true of every level. I would need to gauge that, but certainly at middle to senior levels, we do need you to dive down into the detail. And there must, even at junior levels, be something that you could talk about. So even if it was a disagreement, when you are in the student, you're on a project with other graduates, maybe there's a disagreement over who's doing what, or maybe somebody doesn't turn up and do the work they're meant to be doing. So despite the fact that you had a good objective, everyone knew what they were doing, you put in a process in place, somebody still wasn't doing the work. So that's where you would dive in. So it's always about the challenge. And by doing that approach, that 1, 2, 3, first of all, reframing the question, making sure you understand it, getting the question into a framework that you can answer, then talking through your thinking and the actions, and then just demonstrating that this because you've had experience of this in the past. And let me talk you through that. But of course, despite that, it doesn't always work. And let me tell you what I was able to do despite those actions. Then that really is a nice, strong way of answering these situational questions. Now, in part 2, I'm going to be sharing the experience of one of my clients who had excellent qualifications, lots of experience, but was really struggling to pass these situational questions. And I'm going to be looking specifically at one question and using this 1, 2, 3 technique for you. And the question he was asked was a challenging one, as all of these ones are. How would he implement something at a moment of change? So how would he implement something at a moment of change? And so we're going to be addressing that in part 2. And then in part 3, I'm going to be using the same technique, but this time I'm going to be looking at how we could use it for the hypothetical questions, because a lot of people who are apprentices or applying for apprenticeships or graduate roles will get these situational questions because they don't necessarily have that work experience to draw on. So hiring managers do like them, and I'm going to show you how you can use that same technique. I hope this has been really helpful. As I mentioned earlier, please like it, subscribe to the channel, share it with a colleague or friend. Please add your questions below if you have any. Happy to answer them. And if you're looking for one-to-one coaching, remember you can book a free consultation for our website, and we can talk you through coaching options. Now, you can also, if you are looking for coaching, you can watch our coaching video above as well, or check out our other videos on interview tips. Once I've recorded part 2 and part 3, which I haven't done yet, but once I've recorded those and they've gone live, then I'll make sure that we've got a link. I think it's up here, isn't it? Not down here, but I'll make sure that the link is above so that you can go to part 2 and part 3 quite easily if you'd like to do that. I hope that's really helpful. Good luck with your interviews.